The Eurasian steppe stretches without interruption from Eastern Europe into Central Asia. In winter, its scale becomes more apparent. There are no forests to close the horizon and few landmarks to interrupt the line where land meets sky. Snow does not fall evenly. Wind carries it across the grasslands, exposing frozen soil in one place and piling drifts in another. The surface hardens. Sound travels far. Temperatures sink gradually as autumn gives way to winter. By late season, daytime warmth no longer returns. At night, the cold settles into the ground and remains there. Historical records and modern reconstructions indicate that temperatures of -40°C were not exceptional in this region. In some winters, colder extremes were reached. Air that cold behaves differently. Breath crystallizes. Moisture stiffens fabric. Bare skin loses heat in moments. The steppe offers little natural shelter. Trees are scarce, especially in the central and eastern regions. Hills are low and rounded, shaped by wind and time rather than geological upheaval. Rivers freeze solid. Lakes become fields of ice. Movement across the land remains possible, but only with preparation. Without shelter, exposure is immediate and lethal. Yet this landscape was not empty. For centuries, it was inhabited year-round by nomadic pastoralists. They did not retreat from winter. They remained in place, moving with their herds, setting their shelters against the wind, and continuing daily life in conditions that would immobilize most settled societies. At first glance, survival here appears improbable. There is no obvious fuel, no permanent housing, and no protection from the cold. The danger is not sudden. It is constant, steady, and absolute. In winter on the steppe, there is no margin for error. The question is not why the cold was deadly. It is why, for generations, it was not. The people who inhabited the eastern Eurasian steppe were not settlers in the conventional sense. They did not build permanent towns or cultivate fixed fields. Their economy, movement, and survival were organized around animals. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, yaks, and camels formed the foundation of life. These animals provided food, clothing, transport, and fuel. Without them, survival on the steppe was not possible. The Mongols were pastoral nomads. Their year followed a seasonal cycle shaped by grass growth and weather rather than calendars. In warmer months, groups spread out to prevent overgrazing. In winter, they drew closer together, selecting areas with some protection from wind and with access to pasture beneath the snow. These winter camps were not accidental. They were chosen based on long familiarity with the land, passed down through generations. Mobility was central to this way of life. Families lived in portable shelters that could be dismantled, transported, and reassembled within hours. Possessions were limited to what could be carried by pack animals or carts. This was not a sign of poverty but of adaptation. Excess weight reduced speed. In an environment where weather could shift rapidly, speed mattered. Skills were learned early and practiced constantly. Children rode horses before they could walk long distances. Clothing was made and repaired within the household. Animal behavior was closely observed. A change in herd movement, appetite, or health could signal shifts in weather or pasture conditions. Survival depended less on reacting to crisis than on avoiding it. The Mongols did not understand winter as an abnormal state. It was an expected phase of the year. Preparation began months in advance. Animals were fattened in autumn. Felt was repaired or replaced. Fuel was gathered and dried. Routes to winter camps were planned with care. This knowledge was not written. It was transmitted through practice and repetition. Errors were remembered because they carried consequences. A poorly chosen campsite, insufficient insulation, or neglected herd could lead to loss of animals or life. Over time, systems that failed were abandoned. Systems that worked remained. By the time extreme cold arrived, the Mongols were not improvising. They were executing a routine refined over centuries. The winters of the Mongolian plateau were not unusually harsh by accident. Geography played a central role. The region lies far from any ocean, beyond the moderating influence of large bodies of water. Moisture is limited. Seasonal temperature variation is extreme. Heat escapes quickly into the atmosphere once daylight shortens. Modern meteorological records from Mongolia show winter temperatures regularly falling below -30 degrees Celsius, with colder periods reaching -40 or lower. These figures align with paleoclimate data reconstructed from tree rings, ice cores, and sediment layers. During the late medieval period, when Mongol society expanded across Eurasia, the climate was not milder. In some decades, winters were likely more severe than those recorded today. Cold of this intensity creates predictable physical conditions. Snow becomes dry and granular. Ice thickens rapidly. Organic materials stiffen and lose flexibility. Human physiology struggles to maintain core temperature without insulation and fuel. Exposure, rather than sudden storms, was the primary threat. Death could occur quietly, without warning, during rest or sleep. Historical sources confirm this reality indirectly. Chinese, Persian, and Russian chronicles describe Mongol armies operating during winter campaigns that immobilized their opponents. Rivers frozen solid enough to support cavalry are mentioned repeatedly. These accounts were not exaggerations. They reflected a climate that consistently produced deep, stable cold. The same sources also describe periods of catastrophic winter loss. The Mongolian term zud refers to a severe winter following a dry summer, when animals are unable to reach pasture beneath snow or ice. Such events caused mass livestock deaths and famine. They are documented in both historical texts and oral tradition. Survival was not guaranteed, even with experience. What is notable is not that the Mongols endured cold without loss, but that they did so often enough to sustain population continuity over centuries. Their survival was statistical rather than absolute. Individual families failed. Entire communities sometimes did not endure a season. But the system persisted. This persistence suggests that their shelters and routines were not symbolic or cultural artifacts alone. They were functional responses to an environment that allowed little tolerance for inefficiency. In winter on the steppe, shelter was not comfort. It was a boundary between life and exposure. Winter did not arrive on the steppe as a single event. It advanced in stages. First came the shortening of days, then the hardening of soil at night. Rivers slowed, then stopped. By the time permanent snow settled, movement across the land had already changed. Wheels cut poorly through frozen ground. Hooves slipped on ice. What had been open country became resistant to travel. This was the point at which choices narrowed. Once deep winter set in, relocation carried risk. Animals weakened with each passing week. Snow concealed pasture unevenly, and storms could erase tracks within hours. A family that moved too late might reach no shelter at all. A family that moved too early might exhaust grazing needed later in the season. Timing mattered. The Mongols referred to winter disasters as dzud. These were not single conditions but combinations: heavy snow followed by extreme cold, ice layers sealing grass beneath, or prolonged freezing that prevented animals from feeding. Historical records describe years when entire herds were lost across wide regions. In such winters, survival depended on preparation made before the land fully closed. By late autumn, winter camps had already been selected. These sites were not fortified, but they were deliberate. Low ridges broke the wind. South-facing slopes received marginally more sun. Proximity to winter pasture was essential. Water sources had to be reliable even when frozen. There would be no relocation once the cold reached its peak. This moment marked the point of no return. From here forward, the environment dictated terms. Fuel could not be gathered easily. Materials could not be replaced. Every decision made months earlier now carried weight. Shelter was no longer a convenience. It was the primary barrier between life and exposure. Once the steppe locked over, survival was no longer about movement. It was about staying still in the correct way. The effectiveness of that stillness depended on systems already in place. The primary winter shelter of the Mongol nomads was the ger, known elsewhere as the yurt. Its form was neither accidental nor symbolic. It was the result of long experimentation in a climate where structural failure meant death. By the time of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, the gers design had already been refined through centuries of use. Construction began with a collapsible wooden lattice wall. This circular framework distributed pressure evenly and resisted deformation under wind. Unlike straight walls, the curve reduced exposure to gusts that swept uninterrupted across the steppe. The lattice could be folded for transport and expanded on site, allowing a shelter to be erected in a matter of hours. A ring at the top formed the central opening, which served both as a smoke vent and a source of light. From this ring, roof poles angled downward to meet the wall. The load was carried outward rather than downward, preventing collapse under snow. The roof's slope discouraged accumulation, allowing wind to clear snow naturally. The entire structure was bound with ropes made from animal hair. These ropes tightened as they absorbed moisture and contracted in cold, increasing structural stability during winter storms. No metal fasteners were required. Every component could be repaired or replaced using local materials. Insulation came from felted wool. Sheep's wool was cleaned, layered, wetted, and compressed until the fibers interlocked. Multiple layers were wrapped around the frame, sometimes reaching several centimeters in thickness. Felt provided insulation even when damp and retained heat far better than woven fabric. In winter, additional layers were added, while gaps were sealed with extra padding. The door faced south whenever possible. This reduced direct exposure to prevailing northern winds and allowed low winter sunlight to enter. The threshold was raised slightly, limiting snow intrusion and heat loss. Inside, space was organized with precision. Sleeping areas were positioned away from the door. Storage lined the walls, adding another insulating layer. Nothing was left unused. Even placement of objects affected airflow and heat retention. The ger did not rely on mass or permanence. It relied on balance. Every element served a purpose. When assembled correctly, it created a stable interior environment even as external temperatures dropped to lethal levels. This shelter did not stop the cold entirely. It reduced it to a manageable presence. On the open steppe, fuel was limited. Forests were distant or non-existent, and hauling wood over long distances was impractical. Winter survival required a heat source that could be gathered locally, stored, and burned slowly. The Mongols relied on what their environment consistently provided: animal dung. Dried dung from horses, cattle, yaks, and camels was collected throughout the year. In summer and autumn, it was shaped into flat cakes or compacted clumps and left to dry in the sun and wind. Once cured, it burned evenly and with relatively little smoke. Its energy content was sufficient for sustained heating when used in an enclosed space. At the center of the ger stood a simple iron or clay stove. Earlier forms were open hearths, later designs incorporated flues. The stove's position was fixed. Heat rose directly into the roof space, where it circulated before exiting through the central opening. This vertical movement reduced smoke accumulation and distributed warmth evenly. The smoke hole was adjustable. In extreme cold, it could be partially covered, allowing smoke to escape while limiting heat loss. During calm conditions, the opening remained smaller. During storms, it was managed continuously. Fire was not left unattended. Heat was controlled rather than maximized. Dung burned at a lower temperature than wood. This reduced the risk of structural damage and allowed fires to remain active for long periods. The goal was not high heat but stability. Sudden temperature swings increased condensation, which froze and degraded insulation. A steady, moderate fire maintained equilibrium. Ventilation was essential. Incomplete combustion produced gases that could accumulate in enclosed spaces. Historical accounts record awareness of this danger. Airflow was adjusted carefully, even at the cost of some heat loss. Survival depended on avoiding invisible hazards as much as visible ones. Fuel was rationed. Winter supplies were calculated months in advance, based on herd size and expected cold duration. Excessive burning early in the season could lead to shortages later. Conservation was a daily discipline. Through this system, warmth was produced without reliance on forests or imported materials. Heat was generated from the same animals that provided clothing, food, and transport. Nothing was separate. Energy, shelter, and survival formed a closed loop. In temperatures far below freezing, that loop was all that stood between life and exposure. Heat alone was not enough to survive a Mongolian winter. Without insulation, even a constant fire would fail to maintain livable conditions. The effectiveness of the ger depended less on how much heat was produced and more on how slowly that heat escaped. Felt was the primary insulating material. Its value lay in its structure rather than its thickness alone. Wool fibers are crimped and irregular, trapping pockets of air when compressed. Air, when held still, is a poor conductor of heat. This property allowed felt to slow heat transfer even when external temperatures were extreme. Unlike plant fibers, wool retained much of its insulating capacity when damp, an essential quality in environments where condensation and snow intrusion were unavoidable. Multiple felt layers were applied seasonally. In winter, the outermost coverings were often doubled or tripled. Additional hides could be placed over high-exposure areas, particularly on the windward side. These layers were secured tightly to prevent gaps. Even small openings allowed cold air to enter and disrupt internal balance. The floor was insulated as carefully as the walls. The frozen ground beneath the ger acted as a continuous heat sink. To counter this, layers of felt, hides, and bedding were laid down, creating a barrier between occupants and the soil. Sleeping surfaces were elevated slightly, reducing conductive heat loss during rest, when the body produced less heat. Clothing functioned as mobile insulation. Mongol winter garments were made primarily from sheepskin, fox, wolf, or marmot fur, worn with the fur facing inward. This trapped warmth close to the body while allowing moisture to move outward. Layering was deliberate. Tight clothing restricted circulation and increased frost risk. Loose garments allowed warm air to accumulate. Animal life extended the system beyond the shelter itself. Livestock were positioned strategically around winter camps. Herds broke wind and compacted snow, making movement easier and reducing exposure near the gr. Body heat from animals did not directly warm the shelter, but their presence altered the microenvironment, especially during still conditions. Animals were also living stores of insulation and energy. Wool could be replaced. Hides could be repaired. Even in winter, maintenance continued. Tools were simple, but use was constant. A torn felt panel or damaged seam was addressed immediately. Delay allowed cold to enter, moisture to accumulate, and materials to degrade. This was not abstract knowledge. It was applied physics, learned through repetition. The Mongols did not describe heat transfer or insulation in theoretical terms, but their systems accounted for them precisely. Every layer served to slow loss. Every routine reinforced balance. In temperatures that froze metal and cracked wood, survival depended on understanding what could not be seen.